A struggling waitress risked losing the only job keeping her family afloat, just to secretly pay the bill of a man everyone believed was broke. What she didn't know was that the quiet man sitting alone at that table wasn't poor at all. He was a millionaire, and what he did the next morning left the entire restaurant speechless. But to understand why that moment changed everything, we have to go back to a cool autumn evening in the heart of the city. The streets of downtown glowed beneath rows of amber streetlights as people hurried along sidewalks carrying shopping bags, coffee cups, and the quiet weight of their own lives. Among them walked Adrian Keller. To anyone passing by, Adrian looked like an ordinary man in his mid-30s. His jacket was simple, his shoes slightly worn, his expression calm but distant. No luxury watch, no designer clothes, nothing that hinted at the truth. Because Adrian Keller was worth millions. 3 years earlier, Adrian had built a small tech company out of a cramped apartment and sold it for a life-changing amount of money. Overnight, he became one of the youngest investors in the city. But the success that made headlines in business magazines brought something unexpected with it: loneliness. At first, Adrian believed wealth would open doors to new friendships and relationships. Instead, it seemed to close the ones that mattered most. Blind dates arranged by friends always started the same way. Warm smiles, curious questions, polite conversation. But the moment someone discovered what he was worth, everything shifted. Compliments became exaggerated. Laughter sounded rehearsed. And genuine interest turned into careful calculation. One night, a date leaned across the table and jokingly said something Adrian would never forget. "If we get married, I'm quitting my job immediately." She laughed. Adrian didn't. That was the moment something inside him quietly broke. Not dramatically, not loudly, just a quiet realization. People weren't seeing him. They were seeing his bank account. So Adrian created a rule. From that moment forward, every blind date would begin with the same story. He worked a modest job. He lived a simple life. And he was still trying to figure things out. It became a strange personal experiment. A way to see who would stay when there was nothing impressive to offer. Unfortunately, most people didn't stay. Across town, life looked very different for Lena Brooks. Inside Riverside Grill, the warm glow of hanging lights reflected off polished tables, while the quiet clatter of dishes echoed through the restaurant. Lena moved quickly between tables, carrying trays of food and offering polite smiles to customers finishing their dinners. At 25 years old, Lena had already learned more about responsibility than most people her age. Years earlier, after losing both parents within months of each other, Lena became the primary caretaker for her younger brother Noah. School mornings, doctor appointments, homework help, bills, all of it fell on her shoulders. The dream she once had of attending nursing school had been placed carefully on hold. Not abandoned, just delayed. For now, survival came first. Riverside Grill wasn't glamorous. The hours were long, the pay barely enough, and the restaurant's manager, Mr. Dalton, believed strict rules were the only way to keep employees disciplined. Mistakes were not tolerated. Discounting food? Immediate termination. Covering a customer's bill? Fired on the spot. But despite the pressure, Lena carried something that many customers noticed the moment she approached their table. Kindness. Not forced politeness. Real kindness. The kind that made exhausted workers feel seen. The kind that made elderly customers stay a little longer just to talk. And the kind that would soon change everything. Later that same evening, Adrian Keller stepped through the doors of Riverside Grill for yet another blind date. The restaurant buzzed with quiet conversation as he took a seat near the center of the room. A few minutes later, his date arrived. At first, everything seemed normal. Friendly greetings, small talk, a polite smile. But when the conversation turned to careers, Adrian followed his rule. He explained that he worked a modest office job. Nothing special, just enough to get by. The change was immediate. The woman's interest faded almost instantly. Her tone sharpened. Her questions became dismissive. And before long, the quiet judgment in her voice became something far worse. Humiliation. Other diners began to notice. Some pretended not to listen. Others glanced over with uncomfortable curiosity. And from across the room, Lena Brooks saw everything. She watched the tension. She heard the mocking tone. She saw the quiet embarrassment on Adrian's face. And when the date suddenly stood up, grabbed her purse, and walked out, leaving Adrian alone with a large dinner bill, Lena felt something twist in her chest. Because sometimes, The smallest moment can reveal the biggest truth about someone. And in the next few minutes, Lena would face a decision that could cost her the job keeping her family afloat. But it might also change two lives forever. Before we continue with this incredible journey, I spent countless hours researching and crafting this story to bring you something truly meaningful. If stories like this touch your heart, and you want to see more acts of kindness that restore faith in humanity, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. It truly helps these stories reach others who need to hear them. Now, let's see what happens next. The moment the woman stormed out of Riverside Grill, the entire dining room seemed to fall into an uncomfortable silence. Conversation slowed. Forks paused halfway to plates. A few customers exchanged awkward glances before quickly returning to their meals, pretending nothing had happened. But at table 17, Adrian Keller sat very still. The half-finished dinner in front of him suddenly looked much larger than it had a few minutes earlier. The empty chair across from him seemed to carry the echo of the woman's mocking laughter. Adrian lowered his eyes. He had experienced this before. Still, it never got easier. Across the room, Lena Brooks stood near the service counter holding a tray she had forgotten to deliver. She had seen rude customers before. She had seen arguments. But something about this moment felt different. It wasn't just the humiliation Adrian had endured. It was the way he handled it. No anger and no raised voice. Just quiet dignity. And that made the situation hurt even more to watch. Lena glanced toward the manager's office. Mr. Dalton was busy reviewing inventory sheets, unaware of what had just happened. She took a slow breath and walked toward Adrian's table. "Excuse me," she said gently. Adrian looked up. Up close, Lena noticed something unexpected. His eyes. They didn't look bitter. They looked tired. Not the tiredness of a long workday. The kind that comes from disappointment repeated too many times. "I'm really sorry about what just happened," Lena said softly. Adrian offered a small smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's all right," he replied. "I guess dinner dates just aren't my thing." Lena glanced at the untouched food and the printed receipt resting beside the plate. The total was far higher than most single diners spent, and she knew exactly what that meant. This bill would hurt someone living on a tight budget. For a moment, Lena hesitated. Her manager's voice echoed in her mind. No employee discounts without approval. No covering customer bills. Violating policy means immediate termination. Her job paid the rent. Her job bought groceries for Noah. Her job kept their fragile life stable. But then she looked at Adrian again, still sitting there, still pretending that everything was fine. And something inside her refused to walk away. Lena leaned closer and lowered her voice. "Listen, I know this might sound strange," she said carefully. Adrian raised an eyebrow. "But if the bill is a problem tonight," she continued, "I can take care of it." Adrian blinked in surprise. "You do that?" he asked. Lena nodded slightly. "I've seen worse days than this," she said with a gentle shrug. "And sometimes people just need a little help getting through them." Adrian stared at her for a moment. Not because he doubted her sincerity, but because it had been a long time since someone offered kindness without expecting something in return. "You could get in trouble for that," he said. Lena gave a small, knowing smile. "That's true." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The restaurant noise slowly returned around them. Finally, Adrian shook his head. "I appreciate it," he said, "but I can manage." Lena studied his expression. There was pride there, but also honesty. He wasn't accepting pity, and somehow that made her respect him even more. "All right," she said softly, "but at least let me do this." She reached down and quietly removed the expensive dessert item from the bill. "That one was my mistake anyway," she said casually. Adrian noticed immediately. "You didn't have to do that." "Maybe not," Lena replied. "But sometimes doing the right thing matters more than doing the required thing." For the first time that evening, Adrian laughed. A real laugh. "Do you always break the rules for strangers?" he asked. "Only the ones who deserve it." Their conversation lingered longer than either expected. Lena told him about the restaurant's busy evenings and difficult customers. Adrian shared small pieces of his ordinary job, life, careful not to reveal the truth yet. Something simple happened during those few minutes. A connection, not based on wealth, not based on status, just two people speaking honestly. Before leaving, Adrian stood and thanked her. "You didn't have to help me tonight," he said. Lena smiled. "Maybe I didn't. But sometimes kindness is just noticing when someone needs it." Adrian walked toward the exit. But before pushing the door open, he glanced back one last time. Lena had already returned to work, balancing trays and greeting customers like nothing unusual had happened. Yet Adrian felt something he hadn't felt after any date in the last 2 years. Hope. What Lena didn't realize was that the quiet man she had helped was now asking himself a very important question. Not about the failed date, not about the embarrassment, but about her. Because for the first time in years, Adrian Keller had met someone who treated him like a person instead of a paycheck. And the next morning, he would return to Riverside Grill, not as the quiet man who had been humiliated, but as someone determined to repay a kindness that had touched him far more deeply than Lena could possibly imagine. The next morning at Riverside Grill began like any other. The scent of fresh coffee filled the air. Plates clattered in the kitchen. Early customers quietly sipped breakfast while scrolling through their phones. Lena Brooks tied her apron and began preparing for another long shift. Her mind was already busy calculating the week ahead. Rent due in 10 days. Noah's school supplies needed replacing, and the nursing school application deadline approaching faster than she expected. Life didn't leave much room for distractions, which is why she was surprised when the front door opened and someone familiar stepped inside. It was Adrian. For a brief moment, Lena wondered if she had made a mistake the night before. Maybe the bill had embarrassed him. Maybe he had returned to complain. But Adrian simply walked to a table near the window and gave her a polite wave. Lena approached cautiously. "Well, that's either the bravest customer we've ever had," she joked, "or the only one who enjoyed yesterday's disaster." Adrian smiled. "I came back for the service," he said. "And the coffee." Lena laughed softly. "You're lucky. The coffee's the only thing here we don't burn." Over the next few mornings, Adrian returned again and again, always sitting at the same table, always ordering something simple. At first, their conversation stayed light. Stories about strange customers, jokes about long workdays. But slowly, something deeper began to form. Adrian noticed things others overlooked. The way Lena carefully packed leftover food for an elderly man who visited every Thursday. The way she gave extra patience to parents struggling with noisy children. The way she quietly slipped a free muffin into the backpack of a teenage delivery worker who looked like he hadn't eaten all day. None of it was dramatic. No one applauded. But Adrian saw it. And every small act confirmed something he had suspected the moment she offered to help him. Lena's kindness wasn't occasional. It was who she was. One morning, Adrian asked a simple question. "Why do you work so hard here?" Lena wiped down the table and shrugged. "Because life doesn't give you many options sometimes." Adrian waited. Eventually, she continued. "My brother Noah is 15, she explained. "I've been raising him since our parents passed away." Adrian's expression softened. "That must be a lot to carry." Lena nodded but kept her tone light. "You get used to it." "And nursing school?" Adrian asked. Lena looked surprised. "You remembered that?" "Of course." For a moment, Lena's usual confidence faded. "I want it more than anything," she admitted. "But tuition, that's a mountain I haven't figured out how to climb yet." Adrian nodded slowly. He understood something about mountains. Some were financial, some were emotional, and some were invisible. Not everyone in the restaurant appreciated Adrian's growing presence. The kitchen staff began to notice. "Your friend's back again," one cook joked. "Should we start charging him rent?" Lena laughed it off. But Mr. Dalton, the restaurant manager, noticed something else. Adrian stayed longer than most customers, and he always seemed to be talking with Lena. One afternoon, Dalton called her into his office. "I'm seeing a pattern," he said, folding his arms. Lena frowned. "A pattern? That man who keeps coming in. The one you talk to." "He's just a customer," Lena replied. Dalton leaned forward. "This is a restaurant, not a social club." Lena nodded carefully. "I understand." "Good," Dalton said. "Because if employees start neglecting tables for personal conversations, it becomes a problem." Lena left the office with a knot forming in her stomach. She couldn't afford problems. Not here. Not now. That evening, the restaurant became unusually busy. Every table filled. Orders piled up. The kitchen staff struggled to keep pace. In the middle of the chaos, an elderly regular named Mr. Patterson entered the restaurant. He looked weaker than usual. His hands trembled slightly as he sat down. Lena noticed immediately. She brought him water and his usual soup. But when the bill arrived, Mr. Patterson searched his wallet with growing panic. I must have left my card at home," he whispered. Lena knew the rules. No exceptions. But she also knew Mr. Patterson lived alone. And tonight he looked like someone who hadn't eaten properly in days. Without thinking, Lena quietly removed the charge from the system. "Don't worry," she told him softly. "It's already taken care of." Unfortunately, Mr. Dalton saw everything. He stormed across the restaurant floor. "What did you just do?" he demanded. The entire dining room fell silent. Lena froze. "I was just helping." "You were stealing from this restaurant," Dalton interrupted sharply. The word hung in the air like thunder. "Stealing?" Several customers stared, including Adrian. Dalton pointed toward the office. "Get your things. You're done here." Lena felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Her job, her income, her ability to support Noah, all of it disappearing in a single moment. And across the room, Adrian slowly stood from his chair, because the kindness Lena had shown him days earlier had not been forgotten. And now, it was his turn to act. Have you ever had to overcome obstacles to help someone you cared about? What challenges did you face? Share your experience in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone else today. The restaurant fell silent. Even the kitchen noise seemed to pause. Mr. Dalton's voice still echoed across the dining room. "You're done here." Lena stood frozen beside the table, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear anything else. Around her, customers avoided eye contact. Some looked sympathetic. Others looked uncomfortable. But no one spoke. Except one person. A chair scraped slowly across the floor. Adrian Keller stood up. He walked calmly toward the center of the dining room, stopping beside Lena and Mr. Dalton. "Excuse me," Adrian said politely. Dalton turned toward him with irritation. "Yes? Is there a problem with your meal too?" Adrian glanced briefly at Lena before answering. "No," he said calmly. "Actually, there's a problem with your understanding of what just happened." Dalton frowned. "This is an employee matter, sir." Adrian nodded slowly. "I understand that." Then he gestured toward the elderly man still sitting quietly at the table. "She helped someone who couldn't afford a meal. That's called compassion." Dalton's expression hardened. "In this restaurant," he replied sharply, "that's called breaking policy." A few customers shifted in their seats. Adrian studied Dalton for a moment. Then he reached into his pocket. Out of curiosity, Adrian asked calmly, "How much was the bill?" Dalton crossed his arms. "That's not the point." Adrian placed several crisp bills on the table. "Now it isn't," he said quietly. The room remained silent. But Dalton wasn't finished. "That doesn't change the fact that she violated company rules," he said firmly. Lena lowered her eyes. She knew how this would end. Rules were rules. Adrian glanced at her. For a moment, he saw the same quiet dignity he had noticed the first night they met. No begging, no anger, just acceptance. And that was the moment Adrian made a decision. Adrian pulled out his phone and dialed a number. Dalton watched him patiently. "You're making this more dramatic than it needs to be." Adrian simply waited. After a few seconds, someone answered. "Hello, this is Adrian Keller." Dalton's expression didn't change, but several customers nearby suddenly looked up, because the name sounded familiar. Adrian continued speaking calmly. "Yes, I'm calling about the Riverside Grill property acquisition we discussed last week." Dalton's eyes narrowed. Adrian paused, listening. "Actually," he said, glancing around the restaurant, "I'm inside the building right now." A murmur spread across the dining room. Dalton's confident posture began to weaken. "What acquisition?" he asked slowly. Adrian ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. Then he turned toward Dalton. "You see," Adrian said gently, "this restaurant was scheduled to change ownership tomorrow morning." Dalton stared at him. "What are you talking about?" Adrian looked around the room. 3 years ago, I sold my company for a little more money than I expected." Gasps rippled through the restaurant. "And recently," Adrian continued calmly, "I began investing in small businesses across the city." Dalton's face went pale. "You are the buyer?" Adrian nodded. "Technically, yes." The silence in the room became electric. Lena blinked in disbelief. "You mean," she whispered. Adrian smiled softly. "Yes." Then he turned back to Dalton. "And since the ownership transfer paperwork was finalized this morning." Adrian paused. "I believe that makes me your employer now." The restaurant exploded into whispers. Dalton opened his mouth, but no words came out. Adrian looked toward Lena. "The first night I came here," he said gently, "I was having one of the worst evenings I've had in years." Lena remembered. "You offered to help a stranger who couldn't pay his bill," Adrian continued. "You didn't know anything about me. You just saw someone who needed kindness." He glanced at the elderly man still sitting quietly nearby. And tonight you did the exact same thing for someone else. Adrian stepped closer. In business, we call that character. He turned back toward Dalton. But apparently your policies call it theft. Dalton shifted uncomfortably. Adrian's voice remained calm. I believe restaurants should reward employees who care about people, not punish them. Then he looked directly at Lena. So I have a question. The entire room held its breath. How would you feel about becoming the new manager of Riverside Grill? Lena's eyes widened. I what? Adrian smiled. And don't worry about nursing school either. Her breath caught. Adrian continued. I've already spoken to a scholarship foundation I support. If you still want to become a nurse. He paused. Your tuition is covered. Lena couldn't speak. Tears filled her eyes as the reality of the moment settled in. A single act of kindness had just changed everything. The following weeks transformed Riverside Grill in ways no one expected. Under Lena's leadership, the restaurant became more than just a place to eat. It became a place where people felt welcome, where struggling customers weren't turned away, where kindness was part of the culture. The staff noticed the difference immediately. So did the community. And as for Adrian, for the first time in years, he no longer felt like the richest, lonely man in the room, because he had finally discovered something far more valuable than money. A connection built on genuine humanity. Months later, one evening, a nervous young waitress approached Lena. There's a customer who can't pay his bill, she whispered. What should we do? Lena looked around the restaurant. Families laughing. Friends talking. The warm glow of lights reflecting across tables. Then she smiled. Tell him dinner's on the house tonight. The waitress hesitated. But the policy. Lena chuckled. Kindness is the policy. Across the room, Adrian watched quietly. And in that moment, he realized something extraordinary. A single act of kindness had started a ripple effect. One that would continue long after both of them were gone. 6 months later, Riverside Grill had become one of the most talked about small restaurants in the city. Not because of luxury, not because of expensive renovations, but because of something far rarer. People. Customers began sharing stories online about the warmth they experienced there. Some mentioned how the staff remembered their names. Others talked about the quiet kindness that seemed to exist in every corner of the restaurant. A small chalkboard now hung near the entrance. It read, Kindness served daily. Under Lena Brooks' leadership, the restaurant staff felt something they hadn't felt before. Respect. The kitchen team worked with pride. The waiters laughed more. Even the regular customers noticed the change. But Lena's transformation didn't stop there. 3 months earlier, she had officially started nursing school. Every morning she attended classes. Every evening, she stopped by Riverside Grill to check on the staff and greet customers. It wasn't easy. Balancing work, study, and caring for her younger brother Noah required determination. But this time, she wasn't facing life alone. Because Adrian Keller had quietly become more than just the restaurant's owner. He had become family. Adrian still visited Riverside Grill regularly. Sometimes he came for coffee. Sometimes he simply sat at the same table where everything had started. Watching, listening, smiling. The loneliness that once followed him everywhere had slowly disappeared. Because for the first time in years, he had found something money could never buy. Purpose. And Noah? Noah thrived as well. With Lena no longer constantly overwhelmed by financial stress, their small apartment slowly filled with something it hadn't had in years. Peace, hope, and laughter. But perhaps the most beautiful change happened in the community itself. Riverside Grill began a quiet tradition. Once a week, a meal was reserved for someone in need. No questions asked. Sometimes it was a struggling college student. Sometimes it was a delivery driver finishing a long shift. Sometimes it was someone who simply needed a warm place and a warm meal. The staff called it the kindness table. Customers began contributing anonymously. Soon, the table was full almost every night. Because kindness has a strange way of multiplying. One act inspires another, and another, and another. The truth is, stories like this happen more often than we realize. Not always with millionaires. Not always inside restaurants. But every single day, somewhere in the world, someone makes a choice. A choice to help. A choice to care. A choice to see someone who feels invisible. And those choices matter more than we may ever fully understand. Because sometimes the smallest moment of compassion can change the entire direction of a person's life. Just like it did for Adrian. Just like it did for Lena. And just like it might for someone you meet tomorrow. Stories like this remind us that extraordinary kindness exists all around us. If this story touched your heart, please like this video. It helps more people discover inspiring stories like this. And if you enjoy powerful stories that restore faith in humanity, subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next one. Most importantly, look for opportunities in your own life to become someone's unexpected blessing. Maybe it's helping a stranger. Maybe it's supporting a friend. Maybe it's simply choosing kindness when it would be easier not to. So I'd love to ask you one final question. What act of kindness will you perform this week? Tell me in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone else. Thank you for watching. And remember, you have the power to change someone's entire world.